This is the Stine Seedcast. I'm your host, David Thompson. Join me as we visit with growers, agronomists, seed experts, and other industry professionals about seed, agronomy, and the business of farming. Hello, welcome to the Stine Seedcast. I'm David Thompson, National Marketing and Sales Director for Stine Seed Company. On this special episode of the Stine Seedcast, we provide highlights from our Agriculture Around the U.S. episodes from 2024. So join us as we look back at some of our interviews with Stine regional sales agronomists as we cover the different crop production practices and growing environments in various regions all across the country. First up, we revisit our interview with Stine Region 28 RSA, Hart Hauge. In this segment, Hart discusses how crop production on the East Coast differs from where he grew up in the Midwest, including the climate of the region and how many of the crops are grown for animal production. So, let's get started. So Hart, you live and work on the East Coast now for Stine Seed Company, but as we talked about at the top, you're not originally from there. You came from Minnesota. So I guess I'm curious in your observation, what are the things you've noticed that make corn and soybean production in the upper eastern states unique relative to maybe where you grew up?
So I think the biggest change that I noticed from moving from the valley to the East Coast was the amount of acres that are either minimally tilled or reduced tillage. That was not commonplace for what I was used to. I would say in the valley, 99+% of the acres are conventionally tilled. So kind of learning how that's incorporated into their production practices was interesting for me. And my first few months out here, I was asking a lot of questions.
So are there particular practices as it relates to either corn or soybeans that you notice being significantly different in the area you're in now relative to where you came from?
Yeah, that's a great question. So where I came from, pretty much everything was taken for grain, shelled in the fall, brought to the elevator, marketed that way. Whereas when I got out here, I noticed that there's a lot more silage being grown, which for those people who are accustomed to the sugar beet that you were talking about earlier, it's a very similar process. You get in, you open the fields up, and you get trucks coming in, and you load the silage trucks with that. So actually a fun little stat on the silage acres grown out here in the areas that I cover, at least. Vermont, 88% of the corn acres are grown for silage. New York, we're at 45%, and then in Pennsylvania, 35%. So we see a lot of silage because of the presence of dairies out here. And then another thing on the soybean side, same thing, Midwest, everything goes for grain, or most things go for grain. Out here, you see a little more plenish acres being planted for feeding those dairies. So you're seeing a lot more crop production geared towards animal production versus just strictly grain production to be delivered to the elevator.
Wondering a little bit hard about, again, the climate in the area that you serve in that upper part of the eastern U.S. What do you see there relative to maybe, again, what you're used to coming from the Midwestern Corn Belt, and how does that impact any of the farming practices that you guys see in the area?
Sure, yeah. So something I've kind of found interesting out here, especially in Pennsylvania, and you see it up in New York too, but the humidity levels remain very high throughout the growing season, and GDUs are not hard to come by out here. So with timely rains, very high soybean and corn yields are highly achievable. We see a lot of 200 plus bushel acre corn out here, 60 plus bushel acre soybeans. I've seen as high as 280, 300 bushel corn. I've seen over 100 bushel beans out here. So that was just a really interesting thing for me coming from an area where if you got 170, 180 bushel corn, that was a great year. And 50 bushel beans, you were having a great year on the soybean side of things, where out here they expect those higher yields, and then anything on top of that is what they're really chasing. So typically, I think a lot of the seed salesmen can relate to me on this. When you get a grower call, it's usually not a good call. Well, out here, I get pictures, phone calls of these yield monitors that are just through the roof, and that's when this job is the most fun.
Next up on this special Best Of episode of the Stine Seedcast, we head west to explore crop production in Michigan. Known as the Great Lakes State, Michigan is home to cooler climates, high humidity, and a range of diversified crops like sugar beets, dry beans, wheat, potatoes, fruits, and of course, corn and soybeans. In this episode, Stine Region 15 RSA, Paige Tuggle, dives into how the unique climate impacts crop production and the different agronomic practices in the region. In my travels, I've had the opportunity to visit Michigan a number of times. It's a beautiful state. There's so many great things happening there. From your perspective, when you think about, obviously as a seed company, we're focused on corn and soybean, but what makes corn and soybean production in Michigan maybe a bit unique compared to other parts of the country?
So Michigan, as most people know, is surrounded by lakes. We're called the Great Lakes State. And that impacts our industry immensely. We tend to have cooler climates here and very high humidity. You get a little different type of growing program, I would say. These growers have a very diverse crops that they grow. We have very numerous crops. So we have sugar beets and dry beans and wheat and potatoes and fruits. We're the fifth largest in the nation for apple production. And the dairies are also still thriving as well here in Michigan. So with all those diverse and specialty crops, growing corn and soybeans, growers are always looking at the different crop rotations that they have, and they have to design their program around that. So we have different chemistries that we use here in Michigan. We can't necessarily spray some HPPDs and some herbicides that others would have no problem using in other states. They've got to constantly be thinking of what's going to be in that next rotation or possibly what their neighbors have. They don't want to spray something that could impact what their neighbors are growing. So they kind of have always got to have a little different program than what other states have.
You mentioned climate, and I think that's one of the things I think is particularly unique about Michigan, and certainly you have other states that from a latitude perspective are similar, Wisconsin and Minnesota, your neighbors across the pond there. But again, as you said, you're in a unique spot where being between the lakes, I think certainly does cause a different climactic situation there. Is that fair to say?
So with that, we have a lot cooler air. Also, a lot more cloud coverage. So Michigan has one of the highest cloud coverage days of the year. We have a lot less heat units coming from that sun. With that impacts how the corn and soybeans will grow. Soybeans are very influential to that daylight and how many hours. And then that corn, if we don't have enough heat units, it just won't thrive as well. But also in the same sense, we have that humidity. That corn likes that humidity in the air. And different things like that is what impacts those crops on a daily basis. Also, our weather is impacted by those states. We don't tend to have what I would call a catastrophic weather conditions, such as maybe out in the Midwest where you have more tornadoes and more hail and more catastrophic weather issues. Those Great Lakes will protect us, and we just don't generally get those big episodes. Usually that's towards the southern part of the state. This year we've had 2 E1, EF1 tornadoes. Those are very tiny compared to what are out in the Midwest, So, but those were in the southern part of the state. So, where those lakes aren't protecting us. So that weather is greatly impacted by how those lakes are surrounded.
You mentioned just a sampling of some of the other crops that are grown in Michigan. And again, you have a host of other things. So how does corn and soybean production play into, in particular, some of those? And I don't want to call them necessarily specialty crops, but they are, as it relates to row crop production, they're a little bit different than, let's say, general corn and soybean production. So as growers in your area are working on their crop plans, what role does corn and soybean play relative to some of those other crops?
One thing that's unique to Michigan is we don't necessarily always use 30-inch rows spacings like a lot of the rest of the nation does. We'll use more 15-inch rows. And that is because of the fact that things such as sugar beets, they need to be planted on 28-inch rows. So they'll use the 15-inch rows to help offset the next round when they plant sugar beets in that field. So with these other crops being grown, the growers have to constantly be thinking, I'm growing corn this year, but how does that impact next year's crop rotation, and also what kind of herbicides and HPPDs that we put on there. What kind of chemistry program are we going to use this year that will work with next year's crop rotation? And also, just because I have this type of soil in this field, I could have something 100% different in a field that's on the other side of this section. So they have to grow a lot of diverse maturities, and different maturities due to different soil will impact how that crop is grown.
Oh, okay.
This maturity might work really well in sandy ground, but that doesn't mean it's going to work across a section where I've got silt or I've got more of a swampy type soil. So the growers have to have a diverse portfolio, if you will, of what they're planting. They can't just plant all the same just because they want to harvest at the same time.
Now that we've explored agriculture around the East Coast and in Michigan, we turn our attention to a conversation with Region 24 RSA Derek Dreyer. Derek represents America's dairyland, better known as Wisconsin, where silage corn reigns supreme. So listen in as Derek discusses the value of Stine corn used for silage and the different nutritional aspects of the crop that are important for the dairy industry. So, and I guess one of the other things I think a lot of people would, even those who aren't necessarily deeply entrenched in agriculture, might think of when they think of Wisconsin would be dairy. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, we're known for our cheese, I think, the dairy state.
So
that's a big fact. Yeah.
Yeah. So how does the dairy business impact the row crop side of the business there in Wisconsin?
Yeah, so another factor that corn silage, the dairy industry plays a role would be, we're not just trying to help farmers grow grain corn. We need to maximize tonnage on some of these acres as well. So how can we look at our corn lineup and utilize that for growing silage instead of grain? I mean, grain's a part of that too, don't get me wrong, but I mean, a lot of these guys, you're feeding animals and you're not just harvesting the ear. So it's a little bit different.
How do you translate that type of information? Or can you? Maybe a better question is, what's the process to translate from what you would consider to be, good grain producing hybrids to determining, good products that are available for silage?
Yeah. So, I mean, to back up a little bit, I guess, one usually thinks, when I think of Stine Seed Company and corn in particular, we think of, short stature, high population corn. I mean, that's what everybody thinks of, and rightfully so. That's what we're known for. Done a lot of research in that realm. But we also have some products that I consider very good silage options. And one of the things we try to do every single year is we try to sample for corn silage. We take all our grain hybrids, we sample them with a wood chipper or right out of the field after they've been chopped, and send them to a lab. Usually Dairyland Labs here in Wisconsin is who we use. Very reputable brand, very accurate. So that's one thing. We try to be very precise about this stuff, get the data that the dairy farmers, the guys that are raising cattle want. That's what I was doing earlier today, actually, from 10 to 1:30. I'm taking corn silage samples, trying to take a look at, here's the products we have in our lineup and how do they sample? What is the analysis like on these products? And what we have found over the years is, they might not be corn silage specific hybrids, but that doesn't mean they're not good corn silage varieties. They can be both. They can be a good dual purpose. And I firmly believe we have some excellent corn silage options that we just don't promote enough.
So I guess adding on to that, what would be examples of a few hybrids that have done particularly well in your area that, again, as you said, are probably equally suited for grain production or great for silage option?
Yeah, a couple that come to mind right away. On the early side, a product like our 9320-20, 90 to 95 day range. Great testing product, tons well. The milk per ton on that's a component we tend to look at to decipher how good of a product is for making milk. Milk per ton is what it's called. On the later side, a product like 9818, 9817 is one I'm pretty excited about. I'm going to get some samples tomorrow, actually, on that one from a farm down by Madison. And that's one of these newer products that we have that actually has a white cob, a little bit softer kernel, maybe a little bit more flowery as well. And I believe the initial tests that our agronomy department did last year, 9817-30, that was our most digestible product we have in the lineup right now. So, and it would be, out of all the stuff we did last year, just for a comparison, the University of Wisconsin does a corn silage trial every single year, and it's all replicated and whatnot. 9817 would have been one of the top products in their trials last year if we looked at our data that we collected across a wide footprint compared to what they did. It's a very, very competitive product that's very exciting.
You've been touching on a couple of things, and I guess I want to kind of dive in a little bit, because remember, I was born and raised right here in the heart of Iowa, and so certainly there's silage all across the Corn Belt, but I don't think we do it to the extent that you guys do in Wisconsin. So for the uninitiated like me, let's talk a little bit about how they classify, or what are these criteria? You talked about milk per ton. You talked about, I heard the term digestibility. So when you go to score these things, what are these key, what are the key criteria that when you get that lab result back, what are they looking for?
Yeah, great question. I've said this for years. And when I take some samples into the lab, I'll get a full page and a half back of different different scoring, different scores. And it's kind of, unless you're a nutritionist, it's kind of hard to decipher, put it that way. But there are some certain components you can look at that will be able to tell you how good a product is. Like I said, I mentioned milk per ton. I tell this to growers all the time. If you're going to look at one component on this entire page and a half, look at milk per ton, because that's a summary of everything all in one. But some individual components, what's important to a cow and how they digest the corn stalk, the corn plant, like NDF is one that comes to mind, NDF digestibility. There's a whole system there. Starch is a big one. You could argue that's one of the most important pieces. That's the energy for the cow. They need starch to produce milk or to grow. Those are two in particular I look at, individual components. And there's other pieces too. Even I mentioned 9817 earlier. That's a white cob, more of a flowery type kernel. Generally, we see that product that will have a little bit more readily available starch. So it could be fed out of the field a little bit faster than a non-flowery, a non-silage specific type product will have. So there's some different pieces there you can look at. Again, I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not going to pretend to be one, but if you're looking at a few things here and there to understand this lab analysis report, those would be the ones I would look at.
Finally, as we wrap up our Best of Agriculture Around the U.S. episode, we venture back to the birthplace of Stine Seed Company, Iowa. Stine Region 4 RSA Dustin Ellis sat down with us a while back to discuss the planting and growing conditions throughout the state and the Stine products that shined in 2024, including our Enlist E3 soybeans and MX Series corn. So what are some of the successes you guys have seen here in Region 4 during this past growing season?
So for the way that the weather, has been this year, again, it's been kind of a tricky year for us, but overall, some of the successes is the crops look really, really good right now. And I think we're going to have some really good yield results coming out. Again, I think for the most part, things were put in the right way, and we did get the right rains when we needed them, and it's going to end up being really good for us.
Any standout stories as you're talking to growers? We're just, as you said, the season is probably a little more delayed than it normally is. Anything you're hearing from growers about products that they've got out there?
Yeah, again, the Enlist E3 soybeans are just shining just like they have the last few years. Some of the standout products right now, like we have a 25 EG23 that's really standing out for guys. 17 EE32 is going to be another variety, a little bit earlier variety, but guys are very excited about getting into those. We did have a yield report already around the Fort Dodge area that we heard about this week of some 21 EE62s doing really, really well for us. So again, we're very excited. I think the beans are going to be there. I think packed. Corn is going to be there, and it's going to be an exciting harvest for everybody.
So while you're talking about specific products, that leads into a question I was going to ask. We talk a lot on the CCast about you only get one chance to make that right decision on product. So I wondered if you could kind of step me through, as you talk with the customers that you work with, what are the steps you go through? How do you help them decide what are the right Stine products for their operation and their specific condition?
Yeah, the one big thing is, we have to be really good about asking questions. We ask a lot of questions. What kind of ground is our products going to be going on? What kind of farm? Just all the specific things. At that point, we have to be the ones to ask the questions, and we have to sit there and we have to listen. And if you listen, you get the answers that you need in order to try to pick the right products for growers. And then from there, just with our past experience with our agronomy department, everybody knowing our ins and outs of all the products, we're able to make the best choice for the best acre.
So it's not always the one that won the local plot or the yield trials contest.
No, not always like that. It'd be a lot easier if it was that way, but no. And that is one thing, we always talk about, just like we just said, one product can be the best product you have this year. Next year, it might not be the best, so you have to look at multi-year data and try to figure out what's going to work for you. And again, what kind of ground are you putting it on, all the circumstances that go around growing that crop.
Switching gears a little, talking about corn, anything you're hearing from our MX series line of corn, which is, kind of our latest genetics that we have in the field. Any reports in the field on any of that?
Yeah, we're very excited. We have a couple hybrids right now that are really standing out. We have a new MX 445-G that we're very excited about. Looking at it in the field right now, it just looks really good. The other one that always stands out for us is MX 709-20. Both those products, I think, are going to have a really good year. We're also excited about some of our new products that we're launching, for 2025, our 9755-20 and our 9754-20. Looking at those products last year and all of our plots and everything, and again looking at them this year, there's going to be a lot of hope with those, and we're excited about pushing those out to the growers.
And I know we talked with some of our agronomists here over the summer about things like product development plots. I assume in your area you've had some of those to be able to hopefully introduce new lines that are coming, right? Let people kind of walk in it and kind of have a look at it before they see it in the catalog.
Just hats off to our agronomy department. We have one of the best agronomy departments in the industry, in my opinion. And I'm fortunate enough to have, in my opinion, one of the best agronomists that we have, Tony Lenz, so he's been really good. They've been really good about walking us through all the plots, and letting us have an opportunity to see things hands-on. And now we're doing the same thing with growers. And like you just said, growers are able to go out there. They're able to see it, feel it, smell it, do whatever they want to, and just see, what it's doing for us. And again, back to what we just talked about a little bit ago, we had those products in our trials last year. They did very well this year. They look very good again this year. So when we're choosing products for the best, the best product for the acre, you want to look at 2-3 years worth of data or information to do that for them. Back to, you don't want to just have the one that just did the best this year.
So while we're on that topic of, I guess kind of what brought my mind to that was the idea of year-to-year variability. But one of the things I was going to talk about is, as I said, we're both from right here in Iowa. And I'll say that I think sometimes I hear a lot of folks comment that Iowa is pretty homogeneous in the sense of flat black ground, right? And so given that you cover such a wide swath of Iowa, I guess how would you address the idea that every acre in Iowa looks and acts the same?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to say that it is, but obviously it's not. But I am very blessed. I am in a good area in central Iowa, north central Iowa. We do have some really good black, soil. They always laugh, say it's 6 feet, 6 feet deep, you might say. But then, you go over into western Iowa, and there's hills over there and terraces over there. And I had a funny story when I first started back as an agronomist, roughly 15 years ago. We have a really good grower over in the Mapleton area, and I jumped in a combine with him. And I just remember that day I was scared to death riding on some of the side hills over there. And he even had a side hill John Deere combine, and he's just sitting there harvesting like no other. And I look like a cat trying to get out of a box, so there is a big difference, very good high producing ground, but completely different than some of the other areas that I'm at. when you go east on Highway 20, it changes over that way as well. Really good soil again. You get a lot more sand texture and stuff over that direction. So it's kind of a mixed everywhere. But for the most part, my area, I am very fortunate to have some really good farm ground.
Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today and taking a look back at some of our conversations with Stine Regional Sales Agronomists for this Best of Agriculture Around the U.S. episode. Thank you for listening to the Stine Seedcast. To never miss an episode, subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice. Have a question for our experts? Email asktheseedcast@stineseed.com to have your questions answered on a future episode. To learn more about Stine Seed Company, visit stineseed.com. And remember, Stine has yield.